What if we've got our concept of God all wrong? Welcome to another edition of the Bordering on Belief podcast. Thomas Oord is a theologian, philosopher, and scholar of multidisciplinary studies. He directs doctoral programs at Northwind Theological Seminary in Florida and is director at the Center for Open and Relational Theology. Author or editor of more than 40 books, Thomas has been rated as one of the 21st century's most influential theologians. Tom, thank you very much for joining us today.
Yeah, my pleasure. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Before we get into the deep topics, I think it would be really helpful to have a sketch of your kind of spiritual journey of your life. Just the stages of your spiritual growth. Could you give us share that with us?
Yeah, I grew up and am still part of the Christian tradition. My parents were very active in a little church in my hometown as part of the Church of the Nazarene, which is a small, maybe 3 million people denomination around the world that's linked pretty close to Methodism, United Methodist tradition. I was a kind of kid who went to church a lot, took my faith seriously. I like to say, as a Christian, I gave my heart to Jesus many times as a kid. I was an evangelist as a young person. And then during my university years, I took a course in philosophy of religion that introduced me to the first time to atheists, agnostics, folks of other religious traditions. And for the sake of intellectual honesty, when taking that course, I had to admit that I didn't have the firm foundation or certainty about my belief in God. I remember coming to pick up my fiancée to go to dinner one evening at university. She's now my wife, by the way. And she got in my car, and I turned to her and I said, "I just can't believe in God anymore." I was on a track to be a Christian minister, and so having this crisis of faith was pretty inconvenient. But, I continued to ask the big questions, continued to search, and I ultimately returned to belief in God, thinking that it was more plausible than not that there is a God. I'm not certain there is a God, but I think it's plausible. And early on, it was 2 issues that really sort of made me decide I should become a believer again. One was, I had this search for meaning, ultimate meaning, and I didn't think I could make good sense of something with ultimate meaning if there wasn't some ultimate foundation or source of that meaning, which most people call God. And then secondly, I had these deep intuitions that I ought to be a loving person and that everybody ought to love. Love was somehow the answer. Um, and I couldn't make sense of that intuition, at least in its fullest, if I didn't think there was a ground of love or a lover behind it. And so based on those 2 things, I slowly began to reconstruct my views about God and faith. And, while that was a very, very difficult time in my life, in some ways it was helpful because I kinda introduced in my life, we'll call it a bullshit detector, a BS detector. Like, I wasn't going to affirm something I couldn't really believe. And so if someone said, "You need to believe X," and I thought, "Well, X doesn't make any sense," then I wouldn't believe it 'cause, it just didn't fit. And based on that, I began to build a view of God that I'm sure we're gonna talk about today that's different from what most people think of God, and it's not the traditional or classical views of God.
So, just on this journey of maybe deconstruction and then reconstruction, you mentioned both a kind of philosophical angle and then also intuition, you mentioned. How would you weigh up the relative balance of mind and heart or reason and intuition in your journey?
Yeah, it's tough for me to put more weight on one or the other. I mean, for me, experience is foundational. I am highly skeptical of people who say they put their experience and intuitions aside and they trust only in reason, because I think our experience are inevitably going to affect our reasoning capacities, what we think is reasonable or justified rationally. On the other hand, reason is very important to me. I'm a very much a rational person. You ask my friends or my wife, and I'm the kind of person who wants to have a good argument or good evidence before I'm going to make some decision. So I don't know which one has greater force in my life, but both are essential. In fact, I am skeptical of philosophies. Some analytic philosophers will make claims that disparage experience and intuition, and I'm skeptical about those kind of claims. I want to see those two things united in
Okay.
some way.
Well, let's get into the first topic. What is the nature of God with respect to love?
Yeah, diving right in. um, I think love is God's primary attribute, the attribute by which we ought to understand God's other attributes. Not the only one, but the primary one. And I think love is best thought of as involving three aspects: intentional action, relational response, and the aim to promote well-being, overall well-being. So love as I define it is acting intentionally in relational response to God and others with the aim to promote overall well-being. I think that's what God is up to moment by moment, acting, relating, trying to make the world a better place, you might say, trying to promote overall flourishing. And God is present and doing that at all levels of existence, from the complex to the simplest. Um, and with love as the center, I'm skeptical then of ideas about God that implicitly or explicitly clash with love. So, for instance, many theologians in history across the traditions have said that God is impassible. And by that, they usually meant one or both of the two things. God is not causally influenced by anyone or anything outside of God. And God has no emotional responses to anyone or anything outside of God. God might have internal emotions. Some theologians would say that. But as I see it, love is inherently relational. There's always causal influence going on. And it's almost always, if not always, has some kind of emotional resonance. So I throw out the classic view of an impassible God because I think love comes first, and I'm willing to critique any view, any attribute of God that doesn't fit with love as I've defined it.
What would you say to someone who said that you're applying very human notions of love and projecting them onto God?
I would say there's probably some truth to that because I don't have downloaded into my brain crystal clear revelation from God. um, I think the sacred scriptures have wisdom, and I draw from the sacred scriptures, especially in the Christian scriptures, since that's my tradition. But I have no problem admitting that I'm imagining what God might be like, and I always do that from the perspective of my own experience, which is an embodied experience. And so if someone says to me, well, you're making God in your own image, or you're projecting upon the divine some creaturely attributes, I think in some cases that could be correct, and I'm not ashamed of that. In other cases, I think God transcends creatures in certain ways. So, for instance, um, let's take the issue. Well, we'll get into this, I'm sure, later, but just as a little jumping in, God's relation to time. I think God experiences time moment by moment, analogous to how we do it. So someone might say to me, oh, well, you're projecting your understanding of time upon the divine. And my response would be, yeah, I probably am. I don't apologize for that. However, I also think God experiences time everlastingly without beginning or end, whereas my experience of time had a beginning and will likely have an end. So there's going to be a disanalogy there, or to use the more traditional language in theology, God is transcendent from me in some ways, but immanent or like me in other ways.
Yeah, I think all traditions have to find a middle point between those two
Right.
poles.
Yeah, I'm with you.
Would you go as far to say God is love? Is that too simplistic a thing to say, or is actually just a convenient thing that reveals an actual deep truth?
Yeah, I've got no problem saying God is love, but I recognize that many people have interpreted that phrase in different ways. So if God is love means that any loving action I or someone else does is God, then I'm opposed to that view. There are a number of theologians who take a tack that says any love expressed is never our action or our influence or our agency. Any love is God's agency somehow working through us, either temporarily making us into robots or whatever, but the love that's expressed is God's love. Now, some of those people think that God is still a universal agent and is just using us as puppets, you might say, but some think set aside the personal agent kind of God and say that no, the action or the expression of love is what God is. So God isn't an agent. I'm more in the agent personal side of things. But for me, that phrase, God is love, in the context that we find, at least in the Christian scriptures in First John, the surrounding passages really sound like God is an agent, not just some sort of impersonal force or expression of action. And so think the best way to interpret God is love is to say that not only is love primary in God's nature, but God's loves by necessity. It is metaphysically necessary that God is a lover. And I don't think John, maybe, I think that was the intuition John is trying to express in saying God is love. I don't know that, the writers of First John, or if it was just one person had metaphysical necessity on their mind. But I think that's a good way to interpret that, to put love at the center, even prior to the divine will. So, in other words, God can't choose to not love. God must love because it's who God is.
Well, that it leads us straight into the next topic. So, by putting love as God's essential attribute or defining attribute, even, you're then going to the stage of saying that that then places some limits on what God can and can't do. Is that correct?
That's right, yeah. And one of them that I just mentioned is, since I think God's, loving nature is logically prior to God's will, I think God must love. God cannot choose not to love, to put it in the negative. But when I say God is love, I also, have come to believe that God's love is inherently uncontrolling. So, there are things that God can't do in relation to creation, like control creatures, if divine love is by nature, by essence, necessarily uncontrolling. Um, so, I don't, those sound like limits to some people, although I think just about any concept that doesn't have some parameters or some limits is going to be nonsensical. So you kind of have to have some limits. But
Yeah, I think most people would be quite happy to say that God can't be evil.
yeah,
You know,
yeah,
they don't have a problem, saying that. So you're saying God can't be not loving, but just make that link again to me between being loving and being uncontrolling, because a lot of people
yeah.
would accept an incredibly loving God who also has control over everything. Why do you think that doesn't sit comfortably with this
Yeah.
love?
I think there's two ways to go about it, making the claim that God's love is by necessity uncontrolling. One's a kind of an a priori claim that sits well with some people, and that claim basically says just love by its very nature is uncontrolling. I think the stronger claim is an a posteriori claim, and that is to look around the world and say, if God is love, God would seem to want to act in ways that would be an expression of love. And that would include preventing the genuine evils of the world, the unnecessary suffering, the pointless pain. if I told you that I was a loving person, but then I allowed my kids to abuse each other, even though I could step in and stop it, or even kill each other, you would say, well, that's not an expression of love. Love prevents evil that's preventable. And yet, most theists have thought that God is loving, but either causes what we think of as evil and it's really not evil in the divine perspective, or more often allows creatures with free will to use their evil wrongly. And I'm making the claim that God's love for all is a claim that, if we look around the world, helps us make sense of the suffering in the world, because it says God loves everyone and everything, and this love can't control anyone or anything.
Okay, so it's almost like an inference to you're looking at the world, you're inferring this attribute of God to explain that situation,
That's right.
and I can understand it with regards to, say, the suffering of humans. But would you go as far as to say that, say, God can't stop tsunamis?
I would, yeah. God
So
can't stop
how is that an
pandemics.
expression of love? So how I can understand love with free will of humans and not
Mhm.
controlling them, but I mean, doesn't God control many aspects or all aspects of, say, the planetary movements and things like that? Or do you think even that's not under his dominion? So is there a kind of separation there? I'm a bit confused.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think God controls planetary movements, if by
Mm.
control we mean God acts as a sufficient cause. So, one of the things this view has prompted me and others to do is to then begin to not only ask about who God is, but who we are and what kind of world we live in. And I think it's standard amongst lots of religious traditions, to at least some aspects of those traditions, to afford humans and maybe other complex creatures some measure of agency, free agency, that God either chooses not to control or can't control because they're truly free. But then to somehow make a break in the complexity of creation. Suppose you believe in evolution like I do, and suppose you think that humans are the most complex, and let's take worms as some of the least complex, or cells, even less complex. Um, what many theists have done is said, well, somehow freedom emerges in that system, but at the smaller levels, and people put it at different places in the chain of being. At the smaller levels, there's no agency. God somehow controls that. I've come to think that there's agency top to bottom. Quarks have agency. I think the indeterminacy that many physicists talk about occurring at the quantum level is an expression of the agency and randomness. And that means that I think God can't control even the smallest entities. Now, someone might say to me, okay, but what about the laws of nature? I don't think the laws of nature are true laws in the sense that they're eternal things that must be obeyed. I like the language of law-like regularities. I think these law-like regularities emerge because of the steadfast love of God. God's always going to love because of creaturely conditions, including varying degrees of complexity and varying degrees of agency. And so I don't think God can, stop the tsunami by changing the laws of nature temporarily, or prevent a pandemic from going around the world because God fiddles with the viruses in the sense of controlling them.
You would say that, for example, the laws of nature, all the things that happen in the universe, which physicalists would say are all due to the laws of nature, they are not set by God, they're not directed by God, but they emerge from God's identity. Is that what you're saying?
God's identity and creaturely response, since one of the other things I believe is that God never existed all alone and always is in relation to creation. So creatures, as I mentioned, they have agency. There are patterns of existence that emerge. So I'm with those physicists who reject the laws of nature language and like the law like regularities approach, and then say that there are certain habits that emerge even in the cosmos, in the universe, amongst the more basic levels of existence. And so, yeah, I don't have a God who imposes laws of nature like some theists do. Now, One of my contributions to the discussion is to say this. What most people call the laws of nature, or what I call the law-like regularities, it harkens back to Euthyphro's dilemma. Like, is God subject to some sort of standards or laws outside of God? Regularities, let's say the metaphysical laws of reality. Is God subject to these laws outside of God that prevent God from being able to fiddle with nature and whatever? Or does God decide the laws and therefore, God is the one who freely can break them, it would seem. I think it's best to think of what those regularities, those metaphysical laws, as aspects of God's own nature that God didn't create, that God doesn't impose, but naturally emerge in the ongoing creative process and relationship between God and creation.
Like
So I take a
emanation?
not really emanation, if emanation means that God has no agency or freedom in the process, but kind of
Expression?
like, yeah, they can be expressions of what arises in loving relationships with God and creation. Emanation, has that kind of deterministic bent to it, and it also can lead to pantheism very quickly, and I'm avoiding that.
But, just going to Euthyphro's dilemma, couldn't someone apply the same thing, with regard to the statement that God's primary attribute is love? Is it necessary for God that his primary attribute is love, or was that some sort of choice?
Yeah,
Um,
I want
so
to go the choice route. I mean, I'm
wow.
sorry.
Mm,
I want to go the necessity route
okay.
in
Mhm,
terms of God's nature, but I bring back the choice route when it comes to God's ongoing relation with creation. And
mm.
here's the key move. Those who typically address Euthyphro's dilemma when it comes to God's love think that God is timeless outside of time. I think God moves through time with creatures. I think God's nature is love by necessity, so God must love. God has no choice otherwise. But because God moves through time and the future is open and God can't be certain about how things will play out, God has to freely choose moment by moment amongst possibilities. So there's both a necessary aspect of that, God loves by nature, but also a free aspect in terms of the expression of that love in a universe that God is not sure where it's exactly going.
So, I mean, in moving through time, that's what you refer to as open theology, is that right?
Yeah, open and relational. Yeah, that's a sort of one of the key fundamental tenets in that theology.
So doesn't this lead to a conclusion of an eternal universe?
It doesn't have to. Some people might put it that way, but I think it does lead to a conclusion that there's if you if you add a couple more pieces to it. um, One of the pieces I would add is that God is everlastingly creating.
Mhm.
So yes, there is always going to be a universe God's creating,
So we could have
but
cyclical universes, maybe?
right, cyclical would be a nice way, although I don't want uh, cyclical, at least the Nietzschean version sounds like it's the exact same over and over. I would
No.
want to say there are metaphysical laws that persist through universe after universe, but the universes themselves are different because of creaturely choices and divine action, et cetera, et cetera. I would say this, there's always some creaturely others alongside God because God is always creating in each moment in relation to what God had created previously. But universes come and go. I think our universe began, what do they say, 13 billion years ago? And it'll have a shelf life. It'll end. But then I think another one will come right after it because God is always creating.
So the things you've said so far solve a few problems, that people, theists, generally deal with. The problem
Yeah.
of evil in the world, the problem of kind of non-human suffering in the world, the problem of what was God doing before he created,
Right.
if the universe has a start, and also it kind of touches on why did God create anything? Because you're saying it's almost a necessary part of God's
I am
existence.
saying that. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So it solves a few issues there. Um, some people will say, well, by limiting God, you're no longer talking about the God that is in the Old Testament or the God that Jesus believed in. What would you say to that?
I would say that the Christian scriptures, I don't know the Quran as well, but the Christian scriptures have lots and lots of passages that talk about divine limits. God can't tell a lie. God can't grow tired. God can't abandon us. God can't deny himself, etc., etc. And I would also say that there is no passage in the entire Greek New Testament or Hebrew Old Testament that explicitly says God is omnipotent or almighty. Zero. If by omnipotent we mean one of the three leading ways people use the word, either that God is in control of everything, a kind of a determinist view, or the idea that God can do anything, um, with all things. Nothing is too hard for God. With God, all things are possible. There's a couple of passages that say something like that, but then they turn right around to say some things God can't do. So they've got some inconsistencies. And then I think the third use of omnipotent, probably the one that's closest and the one that I most people have, is something like God is omnipotent because God could control any situation, but God doesn't always choose to do so. God will allow creatures to have their agency. Maybe God, cho- chose to control at some miracle or someplace like that. But generally speaking, this omnipotent God allows creatures to express freedom. I'm rejecting all three of those, and I don't think any of those have a consistent biblical witness to them. In fact, the words that we find in English in the Hebrew scriptures and Greek that are oftentimes translated as almighty are mistranslations of Hebrew and Greek words. In Hebrew, it's the word Shaddai and Sabaoth. Shaddai means something like the breasted one or the mountains. Sabaoth is an army or a group, a council. And those two words were translated as Pantocrator in the Septuagint. And Pantocrator shows up 10 times in the New Testament, once when the Apostle Paul is quoting the Septuagint, and then 9 other times in Revelation. But that word omnipotent shows up in, what is it, the 6th century when Jerome is doing the Vulgate. He chooses Pantocrator. He sees Pantocrator and chooses the Latin omnipotent to match that, which Pantocrator literally means all holding or all sustaining. And then we get omnipotent in Judaism, Islam, Christianity from then on out.
You pushed back against pantheism, but someone hearing this for the first time might think this sounds a bit like panentheism.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Um, I mean, what are the distinctions between what you're saying and panentheism?
Yeah, I mean, there's many forms of pantheism, but I think in its most bald form or most straightforward sense, it says everything that exists is God. And I'm rejecting that. I don't think you're God. I don't think I'm God. I don't think Donald Trump is God, thank goodness. So I'm not saying the world is God. Panentheists want to say that all things are somehow in God. Now, there's at least a dozen different versions of panentheism on offer. When I'm using that word panentheism, I mean that all things are in God's experience. So it's a denial of impassibility. It says God is an experiential agent. And just like right now, I'm in your experience, you're hearing my voice, and I'm in you in that sense. Panentheism, as I understand it, and as others as well, Charles Hartshorne would be a good example. It means that all that exists, from quarks to quail to quasars, affect God. Um, a little phrase I like to use as sort of a synonym for my notion of panentheism is theo-cosmo entanglement. For things to be entangled, they have to be different from one another. But the word entangled suggests a very close proximity.
So do you think God ever existed without the cosmos?
No,
Hmm. So would you say the cosmos is actually an attribute of God?
No, I would say it is something to which God is related, and relating to creation is an attribute of God, but
Okay, right.
creation itself isn't an attribute.
Okay. Yeah, makes sense. All right. So tell us a bit more about your concept of God being subject to time or experiencing time or moving through
Yeah,
time. Doesn't that make time more fundamental than God?
great question. It makes time an aspect of who God is. Yeah. Um, and I like the way you started asking that question, like, God is subject to time. It sounds kind of like God is somehow time is more ultimate or better or
Mhm.
higher or whatever. And a lot of people will say, boy, somehow God is a prisoner to time, they'll say to me sometimes. And I think that's funny because, I could characterize their view as saying that God is subject to being non-temporal or a prisoner to non-temporality. So I think ultimately there's a choice that theists have to make when it comes to God's relation to time. Now, there's various options within the two choices, but fundamentally, it comes down to whether or not experiencing time moment by moment is something that God essentially does. And that's the view I affirm. Or to say that experiencing time is not something God essentially does. And either God is always timeless or God was once timeless and then decided to, quote, enter into time. Um, I'm in the camp that says God's relation to time is essential or necessary because time is an everlasting aspect of who God is. And it's also a way, it fits nicely with my view that God is always relating to creatures because you've got this giving and receiving. There are some in the Christian tradition who want to maintain a timeless God vis-a-vis the world, but say that God has always been experiencing time and they'll shift it to Trinitarian relations. I'm not really that happy with that view. I can stomach it if I have to, but I worry that if you got Trinitarian relations that involve timely giving and receiving, it sounds like you got three deities, and
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
not very attracted to tritheism.
Mm,
So I
yeah.
can overcome that worry by saying God is always relating with some creatures or another.
But could we just rephrase this into say that your concept of God is really a God who experiences or undergoes change? Isn't
Mm.
that really what you're saying when you're talking about this relation to time?
Um, there's some people can talk about non-temporal change or logical change, and I don't think that goes far enough. I think I want to go and say this is real, give and receive with actualities beyond God's self, and that change, the mutability of God, we might say, is in real relations with external others, and I don't think you can do that just making a logical claim. So I
Mhm.
want to make I have an ontological commitment there.
Okay. So can we go are you in this view, are you saying that God needs the cosmos?
In one sense, yes. Yep.
But
God is
is that
love and
actually is need the right word if you're saying it's an
yeah.
essential attribute?
Yeah, it is a tricky question because, what does need really mean? I would say God doesn't need the world in order for God to exist because God exists necessarily, right? So in that sense, no, there's no need. But since I think love is God's reigning attribute, and this love is love of creaturely others, not just love of the divine self, then if God's going to express that, there has to be creaturely others. So God needs creaturely others. Now, I
Or
can
demands?
overcome
It demands it. I think that's a nice way to say it.
demands.
It
Oh, that's
demands it.
pretty good. Yeah. I can
Okay.
obviously meet that challenge by saying, and God is everlastingly creating others. So there's always going to be others for God to love. So yeah, it does get tricky when we use the word need.
Okay, yeah, no, you've helped me understand that really well. Thank you. So we talked about God's relation to time. So just to clarify, do you think God knows the future or not knows the future?
I don't think there's a future to be known. So
Okay.
God doesn't know the future because there is no future to be known. At least if we mean by future, a realm of actual occurrences. Now, I think God knows all the possibilities of what could happen in the future, but I don't think there is a matter of fact. There's no thatness to be known about the future because it hasn't yet occurred.
So the future only exists when we reach it.
Well, yeah, here I'll kind of maybe this is muddying the water, except you seem like, and your listeners and viewers seem pretty sophisticated. I would make a distinction between existing and being real. I think the future is real, but it doesn't exist.
Okay, you're
So,
going to have to help me with that one.
yeah. Um, does 2 plus 2 equal 4? Does that exist? I don't think it does. I think it's a
Okay.
form, eternal object, or whatever. It's real. It's a truth, but it doesn't actually exist. So I don't think the future actually exists, but the realm of possibilities that could eventually become instantiated in the present, those are real.
So the present is an instantiation of what was the future yesterday.
Of what was possible. Yeah,
Yeah.
yesterday. That's right. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I get you. Okay, that's fine. So, okay, so do you pray to God? And if so, what do you mean by praying to God?
Yeah. I actually think my view gives us a much better view of prayer than the alternatives. And to make my case, let me compare my view to 3 other options, all right? And when I say pray, I'm assuming you mean petitionary prayer, like
Petitionary
asking
prayer, yeah.
yeah, yeah. So one view, of course, is the idea that God has predestined everything from all eternity. In that view, petitionary prayer doesn't make a lot of sense because God has already determined what that future is going to be. And in fact, if you take things logically, God predetermined you'd make the prayer, but it's all been settled. So most people think of petitionary prayer as involving some kind of action on our part that could have an influence upon God such that the future might change in some way. But if you're committed to predestination, the future's not going to change, at least not from God's perspective, because it's already been settled. Most people I know have the second model of prayer in mind. They think that in some way our prayers might affect God, but God is omniscient in the sense of not only knowing the present, but also the future, although you don't have to necessarily go that far. But more importantly, they think God is omnipotent and all loving. Now, if God is much smarter than you and I, and omnipotent and all loving, you would think this God could up and do whatever needs to be done to fix whatever problem you and I are praying about. And since God is perfectly loving, God would want to do that, right? So it seems to take the motivation out of prayer because God's smarter than I am. God's perfectly loving, is always going to do the right thing. And nothing can stop this God, at least the omnipotent. Nothing that's logically, possible, at least can stop this God. So I think it also presents a kind of picture of a God who's sitting on the sidelines, arms folded, saying, come on, Tom, you got to pray and ask me 37 times before I get off my ass and do something. Um, and that doesn't paint a picture of a perfectly loving God who seems to always want to do the best given what's possible at every moment. The third model is the one I hear most in progressive theistic circles. They've kind of given up on petitionary prayer. They say, prayer doesn't change God, it only changes me. So I might pray to better understand myself or to get my feelings out of me or some sort of self catharsis, but it doesn't really make a difference beyond myself and to God. I'm rejecting all 3 of those first ones, and I'm going to propose the fourth one as a better model. It assumes God moves through time like we do, so God's not sure what the future is. It also assumes that our actions really have an effect upon us, others, and God because God is not impassible. God is passible. God's relational. And it says God takes up moment by moment all that happens, which includes prayers. And in taking that, we'll call it relational information in one moment, that can have an effect upon what God does in the next moment. In fact, it can open up possibilities and opportunities that may not have been possible had we not acted or prayed in the previous moment. So in this model, you don't have a God who is going to necessarily fix it exactly the way you want it because you don't have an omnipotent God, but you do have an interactive God who responds and is affected by whatever happens in the world, including prayer, and that can actually make a difference on the particular ways God acts in the next moment. What
But
do you think of
I
that
think
long-winded thing?
yeah, I agree with your analysis of the first 3, but
Yeah.
with your 4th one, doesn't it contradict what we said before? Because if I I'm assuming, I might be wrong, that when you say that God is hearing these prayers and that might affect the way God is in the next moment, that that would somehow still impinge on the cosmos. And isn't that slightly going against the working of I got understood that God is not directing things in the cosmos. So
Oh, yes.
for if God if it has if God is directing things in the cosmos, we're kind of I think going against what we said before. If he isn't, then I still don't understand how prayer would have any
Yeah,
bearing on
yeah.
anything.
Let's make a distinction between control, by which I mean God acting as a sole and sufficient cause, and influence,
Mhm,
by which it means God doesn't control or be a sufficient cause. I think God always influences everyone and everything at all levels of reality, moment by moment. So if directing the universe means influencing, yeah, I'm on board. I think most people mean by directing that somehow God is controlling things either by occasionally being a sufficient cause or always being a sufficient cause, and I'm rejecting both of those options. I think because God is always influencing in each moment, and the way God influences is going to be partially determined by what creation is like, then our actions, including our prayers, have some impact on the influence God has in the very next moment.
mhm. And can you give us some sort of analogy just to help us understand what you mean by influencing? I mean, because
Yeah,
obviously it's not controlling,
right.
um, but it's steering. I
Suppose
mean, is it steering?
steering, I like the words like wooing or calling or persuading or those kinds of things. Those are not controlling words, but they're influential. Let me give you an example from my life. My youngest daughter likes to run cross country, long races. Suppose she says to me on Friday morning, "Dad, my shoes are really worn out. I'd like to get some good shoes tomorrow." And I say, "Great. Let's go to the store and get some shoes. What do you want to get?" Suppose she says, "I've been looking online and these new Nikes are really great. I think they would really be helpful." As a loving father who has the money to buy the shoes, I say, "Let's do it tomorrow morning. Let's go get some Nikes." So that's a petition she's given me. And I, out of love, want to fulfill that as best I can. Now, suppose the next morning we get in my car and we're driving to the shoe store, and she says, Dad, I was looking online and it turns out the Brooks are probably going to be better for my feet than Nike. Let's get Brooks instead." Now, she is now a new petition. There's new information. I didn't know about that last night. At least I didn't know she didn't want it. Maybe last night, if I was God, I knew Brooks would be better for her, but I didn't know yet that she wanted Brooks until the next morning. That action then has both those actions, but it's that new action had then is going to change my mind. If in fact I know she wants that and it's going to be good for her, and I've got the money, obviously, then that's going to make a difference. I think creatures influence God somewhat like that. There's going to be some
Mm,
exceptions, obviously, but everything that we do has some influence on God. What we do could never make God do something evil, because I think God's nature is always love. but given the realm of possibilities in each moment, our actions can influence how things play out.
But is the influence that's coming from God onto us only in a kind of psychological realm, in the way we look at things, or is it in a material way as well? Like what might we
I
might
Yes.
bump into
Okay,
something
yeah.
that day?
It is material, but,
Mm.
um, it is so I think God is, to use the technical language, an efficient cause, not just a final cause or formal cause. But I think divine materiality is not perceptible by our 5 senses.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, I I happen to believe in non-sensory perception, but, so we can't see God's materiality or smell it or taste it. Um, I think God has this material dimension in part because I'm prone to one of metaphysics that gives me a analogous kind of language for God's action and ours. So instead of making God this exception to everything, like most theologians do, I think God is an efficient cause like we are, but God is more like a mind that we assume is in our heads, at least some of us assume are in our heads, that we can't see with a microscope, but seems to have real causal influence on our brains and bodies. Except in God's case, I think God's a universal mind. If minds have material dimensions, which I speculate they do, then God's like a mind with a material dimension and mental dimension, but can't be perceived with our 5 senses.
Okay, that's taken an unexpectedly deeper turn there. So
Okay.
are we now going to idealism here, that really
Mm,
the fundamental world in which your daughter wants Brooke trainers is actually mental,
mm.
and what we are seeing is just a projection of that?
Yeah. I'm a material mental monist, which is a form of panpsychism. So I'm not an idealist, at least those idealists who want to deny the ultimacy of materiality. I think every entity that exists has both material and mental dimensions, from quarks to quail to quasars, and let me add God now as well. God has both material and mental dimensions. So
What are the material dimensions of God? Are they the ones we can't sense, or are
that's
they
right.
or is it when we see that sunrise and we feel something, we're actually experiencing a material dimension of God at that moment?
No, I think of that as an inference of divine
Uh-huh.
action. And I think we have direct causal influence from God, not just inference. So, in order to
Okay.
make that all a reality, I've got to talk about how somehow we can perceive the divine, even though our 5 senses aren't doing the perceiving.
Yeah.
And that's where I'm bringing in non-sensory perception, following Alfred North Whitehead's view of prehension and some other folks who John Wesley talked about spiritual senses, that sort of thing.
But I mean, I think a lot of traditions have the concept that the soul can kind of get knowledge of God in a way that the mind and stuff can't. Is it very
That's
different to
true.
that?
Well, I don't really believe in a soul. So,
Mm.
for me, soul language is just mind language. So
Yeah,
I'm
sure.
just
But I mean, if you deepen the mind to a level where it's in connection with God's influence,
yes.
we're getting to something
I
pretty
think
close to
the
a
mind
soul.
is yeah, I think the mind is directly influenced by God. But you know what most people would do, well, one major way to talk about this is to go the way of Thomas Aquinas and say, God is immaterial. God somehow influences the material world. It's never quite clear how that works with
Yeah.
Aquinas and others, but they do have a fairly good way of talking about an immaterial God influencing our immaterial aspect, which would be the soul or the mind. Uh, so, at, so we end up being spiritual beings in relation to a spiritual God, and by spiritual there we mean that which is immaterial, and so idealism fits nicely there. What I'm reaching for is a conceptual apparatus by which a God with both material and mental aspects has direct causal influence not only on my mind, which I think has material and mental aspects, but my brain, my body, ants, cells, civilizations. God is not an exception to what it means to exist as some sort of spiritual thing out there. God is present to all creation and has both the material and mental aspects necessary for the kind of causation we typically want to talk about.
So that statement and several of the others do seem kind of very unifying. Could you find a word? It kind of gets rid of a lot
Yeah,
of dualities or
that's right.
um,
Yes.
silos.
Very important to me.
Okay. You mentioned earlier about how you believe in evolution. So tell us, does everything you said so far about your conception of God naturally lead to a kind of acceptance of all of the findings of science, or is that a choice?
Yeah. I'm pretty reluctant to say it fits with all findings of science because I think science got some contradictions within it, various camps and schools, etc. But I'm very comfortable saying this view of God fits nicely with the general ideas of evolution, that change occurs over time, that something new emerges. Yeah, it whether or not it's a necessary entailment, I don't know if I want to go that far, but at least it aligns very
Fits well.
nicely.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. How then do you look at scripture? If, because that's the biggest problem that, modern day Christians may have. How do you read Genesis, for example? Do you have to reread it in a different way, or do you feel that you can read it in an authentic way? How would you do that?
Well, let me answer that by first starting with Genesis and then sort of stepping back and looking at scripture more broadly. I assume you brought in Genesis because of the creation accounts there. And Genesis 1 and 2 don't have a God creating something out of nothing, has the Spirit hovering over the face of the deep. And at least in the Christian tradition, even some of the most conservative biblical scholars admit that creation out of nothing is not in Genesis or in scripture more generally. Now, there is one passage in Second Maccabees that does use the word nothing. It's not in the Protestant canon, but some Catholics will point to that. But if you read the context of that, it also doesn't align with creation out of nothing. So, if we ask the question, what kind of theological moves seem to be happening in Genesis when it comes to creation? Those theological moves fit really nicely with the proposal I'm putting on the table. Now, I'm not a six-day creationist, so I don't take the days literally as 24 hours, and so there's gonna be some probably conflict with contemporary science and at least the way the what I think of as a creation hymn in the first parts of Genesis or the Adam and Eve story, etcetera. So I'm not taking them literally as necessarily historically happening, but if we stand and ask the theological questions, yeah, a lot of that fits nicely with my view. If we look at scripture more generally, I think the themes of love are prominent in scripture. I think we find it in the Hebrew scriptures. In fact, probably the most, steadfast love of the Lord endures forever is one of the most often phrase we often find there. Many biblical books talk about a little phrase about God being slow to anger and merciful, etc. And in the New Testament, of course, we've already mentioned John, but also the revelation of God in Jesus seems to point toward love. But there are definitely passages in scripture that seem to go against the ways of love, sometimes portraying God as unloving, God wanting genocide, for instance. And those passages I think are flat wrong.
So you think they're basically human authored
Yeah, well, I think
mistakes?
the whole thing is human authored, but
Yeah,
I
but they're
think
not
some of those,
reflective of God's inspiration.
yeah, those folks have not understood God well when they portray God as unloving.
Mhm.
I used to, when I was younger, kind of hem and haw, try to figure out some way to make those fit. But now I just think, no,
Just
um,
jettison them, it's easier, yeah, and
yeah,
it's more coherent, yeah, mhm.
yeah, yep. I think, and I'm not doing that because I think I'm smarter than everybody else, or I'm a 21st century postmodern philosopher who's got the inside track or whatever. I'm doing that because it seems to me the prominent biblical witness is a God of love, mercy, and forgiveness. And those passages that portray God otherwise conflict, and I'm enough of a person to want to have a consistent theology.
Yeah, and just, going back to experience again, I mean, a lot of non-Christians who read those passages immediately balk and go, "That doesn't
Right.
sound like God." It just
Exactly.
doesn't that doesn't sound
Good
like
for
God.
them.
Yeah. Um, not at least not the God we think of. Okay,
Yeah.
let's talk about another topic which I think is very close to your heart, in general terms, and then we'll narrow it down to your specific experiences. Where do you place faith versus religion versus church, i.e., institution? What are the roles of those things in the life of a believer? Do you think?
So a person's faith versus the institution that we're asking?
So yeah, faith is a kind of generic thing. So faith in
Okay.
God.
Yeah.
It may be philosophical like yours. It may just be a very kind of instinctive,
Yeah.
feeling that there's a higher power. Then religion, as in following one of the well-known traditional religions with certain practices,
Yeah.
and a theology normally. Not all of them have theology, but most of them have a theology. And then, of course, institutions. Let's leave the institution to the end. But
Yeah.
how important is religion versus faith?
Yeah. Well, I think it's hard to cut religion out entirely because I think as I'll start with individuals. Individuals, I think we have certain beliefs about ultimate reality, and those beliefs might include belief in God, like I have, and apparently the majority of people, at least in the West, believe in God. And obviously we have different beliefs and those may be incoherent or whatever, very worked out or very inchoate. So these beliefs that we have as individuals, then we end up going through changes and we're in relationship with others and we compare and contrast and some things we learn from one another. It's not all just, us coming up from it. We're getting ideas from some and they work or they don't work. And some folks we admire and seem more authoritative. And so we sometimes accept their views, even though it might not make sense to us. And so there's lots of things going on at the individual level. And then I think religions emerge because people see similarities, they wanna coalesce, they see that, these kinds of ways of thinking make sense to them, and they wanna be around people who think similarly, even though good religion's gonna have some place for those of differing opinions, but they have to somehow, in my tradition, actually, this goes way back to Augustine, there's a line that says, um how's it go? Liberty on the non-essentials, charity on the essentials. No, unity on the essentials, liberty on the non-essentials, and charity on all things. Um, and I think lots of folks are attracted to that idea, although how it actually plays out, it's very diverse. But the idea that we can be unified in some things and let other people think differently on other things that aren't that important, but then let love be above all charity.
Mm.
So the problem, though, is that religions, people at least think that religions are timeless. People get the idea that, take Christianity, for instance, since I know it best. They think in some way Christianity is a set of beliefs and practices that are going to go generation to generation being exactly the same because they make up the essential core. History doesn't tell us that's exactly what happened, but that's how people think of religions. I think of religions as much more pliable, that they change. Now, they may not change quickly, but they do change. And part of the history of religion is that when people disagree with one another, they break up. So, in terms of religions, I'm kind of wandering now in response to your answer, but I think they have a role to play, and they're probably a necessary outgrowth of individual piety. But I don't think they're ultimate. I think they're temporary expressions, and we shouldn't worship them.
Mm. God is greater than religions. Yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
Final question, just 1 minute. um,
Oh my.
Say if you had a minute with somebody on an underground train or waiting for a taxi or something like that, and they said, I've got a sense of spirituality. I'm quite a spiritual person, but I just can't find God or think of, find a way of getting to God. What would you say to them in that 1 minute you had?
I'd say that's okay. Um, do you want to love? Do you think love is important? I can get along well and encourage people who want to love. Now, for me personally, Love is best understood in relation to a God concept, but I know that the word God or similar words are problematic for lots of people. So I'd probably shift the focus toward love and away from trying to convince them to believe in a God.
Thomas Oord, thank you very much.